They bragged about courage, claimed nothing could shake them. The loud ones, the bold ones, the self-proclaimed fearless. Yet the second you stepped in, silence hit like thunder. Eyes widened, breaths locked, voices died mid-sentence. Because your energy wasn't noise, it was gravity. It bent the air, froze the proud, made every brave one reveal their fear. Understand this. Courage is easy in theory. Anyone can look strong when untested. But true power isn't shown in words, it's exposed in presence. And your presence stripped their armor bare. No speech, no threat, no gesture, just energy. The kind that cannot be faked, cannot be resisted. They froze, not because you acted. They froze because you existed. Even the boldest feel it. The weight of silence when it's carried by someone unshakable. They didn't freeze because they lacked courage. They froze because your energy revealed the truth. Their courage was conditional. Yours was not. You walked in and reality shifted. The fearless became speechless. The proud became still. And all of them knew something greater had arrived. They had trained themselves to laugh at fear, to stand tall in chaos. But when you entered, it wasn't chaos, it was order. An order so sharp it cut through their bravado. They weren't facing a threat, they were facing proof. Proof that true presence doesn't shout, it bends the room. And in that moment, their practiced boldness collapsed under the weight of reality. You didn't need to announce yourself. The air announced you. The room carried your signature before you spoke. That's why even the bold ones froze. Because deep down, every human knows when power walks in. Not the power of status or wealth. The power of resilience, silence, an unshakable core. And against that, noise dies. Pride evaporates. Pretenders fall quiet. Bravery is loud when it's untested, but silence reveals truth. And when you walked in, silence became the test. Their voices faltered, their gestures froze, their eyes darted, searching for safety. Yet there was no safety. Only the undeniable weight of your energy pressing against the walls. They couldn't fight it. They couldn't name it. They could only freeze. Energy is felt before it's understood. And yours carried storms, scars, victories unspoken. It wasn't performance, it was essence. That essence bent the atmosphere until even the strongest postures cracked. That's why the bold froze. They weren't defeated by you. They were defeated by what you represented. The kind of strength that cannot be staged, only lived. They remembered every time they mocked you, doubted you, dismissed you. And yet, here you were, untouched by their disbelief. Your walk carried the proof, and proof is heavier than any insult. That's why their eyes shook. That's why their voices died. Because they realized no amount of bold talk could erase the weight of your return. You didn't come for revenge. You didn't come to prove them wrong. You came because you refused to bow to storms meant to erase you. And that refusal clung to your aura like steel. That's why they froze. Because they saw in you what they never built in themselves. Resilience that doesn't ask, doesn't beg, doesn't bend. Even the fearless break when they face authenticity. They had shields of pride. You had nothing but truth. And truth is heavier. Truth is colder. Truth makes even the strongest voices stumble. That's why their boldest froze, because for the first time, they realized courage without truth is just theater. And theater collapses when reality walks in. The crowd doesn't freeze for noise, they freeze for silence. And your silence roared. You didn't need fire in your words. Your presence burned enough. Every second you stood there, unshaken, carved fractures into their confidence. That's what they feared. Not your actions, not your words, your stillness. Because stillness backed by survival is louder than chaos. The bold freeze. Not because they are weak, but because they recognize strength they cannot counterfeit. They can fake power until true power arrives, and when it does, instinct silences them. That's what happened the moment you walked in. Their instincts bowed before your energy, their mouths closed, their eyes widened, and their courage, conditional, fragile, collapsed into stillness. Confidence looks solid until it meets a storm. And you walked in carrying storms within your silence. They felt it in their bones, the weight of someone who endured everything and still stood taller. That's why they froze, because their courage was rehearsed. Yours was lived, and lived strength makes rehearsed bravery look like theater. They couldn't hide it. Their eyes betrayed them, hands stiffened, voices cracked. Even their so-called leaders swallowed their pride in silence. You didn't demand fear, you revealed it. Your presence stripped away masks, exposed how fragile their boldness truly was. And in that frozen moment, they realized courage without resilience is nothing but costume jewelry. The bold love to dominate rooms with noise, but your silence suffocated their noise. Not through anger, not through violence, but through undeniable weight. The kind of weight only born from scars, from pain, transformed into steel. That's why they froze, because they saw truth standing before them. And truth is heavier than every performance they ever staged. Understand this. You don't freeze the bold by force. You freeze them by existing as proof that their courage is borrowed. Your energy wasn't loud. It was timeless. A calm forged in storms they couldn't survive. That calm crushed their bravado. And in one instant, they learned the difference between loud confidence and silent power. Power always wins. The bold ones looked around for backup, for distraction, for anything to break the weight you carried, but there was nothing. Just silence pressing on their chests. That's when they knew. Your energy wasn't negotiable. It didn't ask for attention, it commanded it. And command without effort is the one thing their pride can never imitate. They froze because instincts don't lie. Words can. Gestures can. But instinct knows when it stands in the presence of something greater. And their instincts screamed. That's why their bodies stiffened, why their voices died. Because instinct recognizes survival, and survival radiates differently than performance. You didn't claim the space. You owned it by existing. You carried silence like an edge, not pointed, not swung, just held. And that edge cut deeper than anything they'd ever faced. Because silence forces people to face themselves. And when they saw themselves in your presence, they realized their courage wasn't built for this. They froze because reflection is colder than fear. and you were their reflection. The bold thrive when the crowd is behind them. But when the room shifts, when eyes betray doubt, their energy collapses. You were the shift. You bent the atmosphere until even their allies questioned them. That's why they froze, not only at you, but at themselves. You turned their stage into a mirror, and their own reflection broke them. They thought their fearlessness was eternal, but eternity ended the moment your shadow touched the floor. In that instant, they saw what real fearlessness looked like. Not noise, not pride, not arrogance, but presence. And presence doesn't end when the crowd stops clapping. Presence stands even in silence, especially in silence. That's the presence that froze them. Every bold claim they ever made collapsed in that second. They froze not because you spoke, but because you didn't need to. Their stories, their boasts, their shields, all useless against one undeniable truth. You survived storms they can't imagine. And survival changes the way silence feels. Your silence carried storms. Theirs carried excuses. And excuses can't move when truth walks in. They'll never admit it out loud. They'll laugh, deflect, pretend, but their freeze already confessed. Because courage doesn't falter in safety, it falters in truth. And truth was written across your walk, your stillness, your unshaken eyes. That's why they froze. Because your existence proved every claim they ever made was smaller than the reality standing before them. The bold ones didn't lose to you. They lost to themselves, to the reflection you forced on them, to the silence you carried in, to the weight of storms they've never survived. And when that weight pressed into the room, they froze. Not because you demanded it, but because presence born in fire cannot be denied. And you are fire walking. The moment stretched long, their bodies stiff, eyes wide, minds scrambling. They weren't afraid of you. They were afraid of what you revealed, that their boldness was fragile, that their power was borrowed, that their voices were loud only because silence hadn't entered yet. And when silence came with you, they froze. Because survival doesn't lie, it shows. You didn't need applause. You didn't need recognition. The freeze itself was your crown. Because freezing means they felt it. They may deny it later, but in that instant, their instincts confessed the truth. You shook them without a word. You bent them without a move. And bending the bold is the highest proof of power anyone can carry. They'll talk later, trying to spin it. We weren't afraid, we were just surprised. Lies, because instinct tells the real story. Instinct doesn't fake tremors in the hands. Instinct doesn't fake the pause in a throat. Instinct bows when it meets power. And when you walked in, instinct silenced every bold claim they had rehearsed. The bold ones feed on attention, but when your presence steals the air, attention betrays them. Their spotlight shattered, their audience evaporated, because nobody watches the actors when the storm itself enters the stage. You weren't performing. You were undeniable, and that undeniability froze them in place, reminding them courage without truth collapses instantly. Some of them tried to smirk, to mask their fear, but masks don't survive weight, the weight of scars, the weight of survival, the weight of silence. Thicker than any boast, their smirks cracked, Their posture faltered, and for the first time, they saw themselves clearly, not as bold, but as fragile. And fragility exposed is enough to freeze anyone. Energy doesn't lie. You carried storms in your breath, fire in your silence, steel in your walk. They froze because energy doesn't ask. It announces. And the announcement was undeniable. You survived what should have broken you. You endured what should have erased you. And that endurance now bends space. Their boldness wasn't erased by you. It was erased by truth. You didn't freeze them with force. You froze them with proof. Proof that storms create silence heavier than speeches. Proof that scars create energy sharper than weapons. Proof that resilience creates a presence that cannot be ignored. And proof terrifies pretenders. That's why their boldest froze, because they knew they had never touched that kind of truth. The silence you carried spread like ice. It moved through the room, crawling up spines, locking jaws, stiffening hands. Even the boldest couldn't escape it, because silence isn't absence, it's presence, and your presence carried gravity. A pull they couldn't resist, a pull that froze them where they stood, caught between pride and the undeniable weight of truth. They thought their courage was unshakable, but courage untested is nothing but theater. You became the test, and the test revealed them. That's why they froze, because the moment you entered, every claim they ever made crumbled under a reality they couldn't deny. You weren't louder, you weren't harsher, you were simply undeniable. And undeniable always wins. Some froze in fear, others froze in awe, but all froze in recognition. Recognition that your energy wasn't ordinary. Recognition that storms had forged you into something they couldn't imitate. And recognition is deadly to pride. Because once truth is recognized, pride has nothing left to hide behind. That's why even their boldest became still. Freezing is the body's last confession. A confession they'll never speak aloud. But in that pause, in that silence, they admitted everything. That you carried more, endured more, became more. They froze because they felt it. Energy too heavy for performance, too sharp for pretense. And in that freeze, they surrendered without words. And here's the truth. You didn't walk in to make them freeze. You walked in because that's who you are now. Energy sharpened by storms. The freeze was just the proof. Proof that even the bold collapse when presence enters the room. Because presence isn't staged. Presence isn't loud. Presence simply exists and forces the world to adjust. The freeze lingered. Seconds stretched like hours as your silence filled the air. They couldn't hide it, couldn't mask it. Even their boldest stared, trapped in a moment they couldn't escape. Because presence doesn't allow escape. It demands acknowledgement. And in that demand, they realized the truth. They were standing in front of something greater than courage. They will remember that silence long after the noise fades. Because silence backed by power etches itself into memory. They froze once, and that freeze will haunt them. Every time they boast, every time they pretend, they'll remember the moment their bravado cracked, and memory itself will whisper, "Your boldness isn't real. It froze when truth walked in." Understand this. Freezing isn't weakness, it's recognition. Recognition of something that can't be explained. You didn't threaten them. You didn't move against them. But your energy was undeniable, and denial collapses under undeniable. That collapse is what froze them, because the body knows when it faces a presence that can't be dismissed, and your presence cannot be dismissed. Even their boldest had no script for this. They had comebacks for insults, shields for attacks, masks for judgment, but they had no defense for silence carrying storms. And that's what you brought, storms in silence. That silence stripped their pride, broke their rhythm, shattered their control. And when control vanishes, boldness freezes. They'll try to forget, but they can't. Because freezing etches truth deeper than fear. They froze because they felt survival in your walk, authenticity in your stillness, storms in your eyes. And that kind of truth burns itself into memory. They can pretend all they want, but when they face silence again, they'll remember you, and they'll freeze again. This is what they fear most, that you didn't try to freeze them. It just happened. Because real energy doesn't chase. It arrives. Real presence doesn't demand. It shifts. Real strength doesn't roar. It bends the air. That's why even their boldest froze. Because they realized power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just walks in, and everything else stops. Their freeze was proof. Proof you've crossed into a realm where power isn't explained. It's felt. Where energy isn't argued. It's undeniable. Where even the boldest break under silence. You didn't need to perform. You didn't need to fight. You simply carried storms into the room. And storms don't argue with trees. They uproot them. You don't need to replay that moment. It will replay itself in their minds forever. Every glance, every pause, every frozen second will remind them that courage without scars is fragile. Remind them that boldness without storms is shallow. Remind them that truth carried silently is the one force they can never counterfeit. And here's the irony. They admired you even as they froze, because deep down, everyone craves authenticity. Everyone respects survival. And when you walked in, they met both. Fear dressed itself as stillness, but beneath that fear was awe. Awe that someone could carry so much without a word. Awe that silence could feel heavier than thunder. The bold froze, but you didn't stop moving. Because freezing wasn't your story, it was theirs. Your story is motion, forward, upward, stronger. Their pause was proof, but your walk is destiny. And destiny doesn't freeze. It doesn't wait. It doesn't ask. It moves. And when destiny moves, even the boldest become statues. So let them whisper about that day. Let them replay excuses. Let them pretend their freeze was nothing. Because truth doesn't need defense. The moment spoke for itself. You walked in. Energy shifted. Silence roared. And the bold froze. That sequence is carved into history now. Whether they accept it or not, history doesn't erase silence. It amplifies it. And now, every room you enter carries the echo of that moment. The bold will remember. The crowd will whisper. And silence will follow you, not as emptiness, but as crown. Because silence backed by storms is the purest form of power. That's why they froze. That's why they trembled. And that's why you walk forward, untouchable, undeniable, unforgettable.